1124. And just as a heads up, we'll see if we get to execing that bill. Doubtful, but. So House Bill 1124. Serena.
Thank you, Chair. Serena Dolly, staff to the committee. House Bill 1124 relates to rent and related fees. The bill includes provisions for tenancies covered under the RLTA, as we've been talking about this morning, but also under the Manufactured Mobile Home Landlord Tenant Act, or the MHLTA. As background, the RLTA includes provisions governing residential rent increases, late fees, and the termination of a tenancy. For rent increases, the RLTA specifies that a landlord must provide at least 60 days written notice, and any rent increase may not become effective until the end of the rental agreement. In terms of late fees, a landlord may not charge late fees for rent that is paid within 5 days of its due date. Shifting to when a tenant wishes to end a tenancy under the RLTA, generally a tenant who terminates a lease early is liable for rent until the end of the term of the lease, although the landlord is required to attempt to re-rent the unit. For a month-to-month rental, a tenant typically is required to give 20 days written notice prior to the end of the month in which they wish to terminate the tenancy. Shifting to the Mobile Home Landlord Tenant Act, which applies to mobile home lot rentals within a mobile home park where a tenant has no ownership interest in the mobile home park or lot. Rental agreements under the MHLTA must be for a term of 1 year unless a longer term is agreed, and a landlord must provide a tenant with 3 months written notice of any rent increase. That rent increase may not become effective before the end of the term of the rental agreement. If a tenant does not wish to renew a rental agreement, the tenant must notify the landlord 1 month prior to the end of the rental agreement. The bill before you, House Bill 1124, prohibits a landlord from increasing a tenant's rent under the RLTA or MHLTA by more than 5% without providing written notice between 180 and 220 days. The written notice must inform, and then the landlord must allow, the tenant to terminate the tenancy at any time prior to the effective date of the rent increase by providing at least 20 days notice for a month-to-month lease and at least for a month-to-month agreement, or at least 45 days notice for a tenancy with a lease. In addition, the landlord must prorate the rent owed to the tenant's move-out date. A tenant who is charged and pays rent reflecting an increase of more than 5% without receiving the required notice may recover damages, costs, and attorney fees. Finally, the bill limits the late payment fees for late payment of rent to $75 for tenancies covered by the RLTA only. That concludes my briefing. I'm happy to answer questions.
Any questions for staff? Seeing none. Representative Peterson, speak to your bill. Yes, this is my bill for the record. Strom Peterson, representing the 21st District. This is legislation that we talked in this committee about last year. I think we have seen over the last couple of years headlines from around the country, not only here in Washington, about some pretty incredible rent increases. And this does not lump all landlords into one pool. We know that many landlords, housing providers, have very close relationships with their tenants and try to keep these rent increases to a minimum and giving their tenants some warning if this is happening. Unfortunately, that is not always the case, and I think, as Representative Marcus says, often we are legislating to the smaller percentage of people out there that are not acting in the best interest of their communities or the best interest of this very important landlord-tenant relationship. This is, after all, people's housing. So I believe this is a fairly simple and straightforward bill, and if there is a rent increase that's coming, and I think landlords are professionals. This is, often they may be a professional organization, or even for the smaller landlords, this is an important investment that they have in their properties. And so when they see costs rising, as small business owners, they should be able to project into the future what those costs are going to be. So I think a 6-month notice of a significant rent increase is reasonable as a business owner, as a former business owner, as you see prices increasing and you know that you have to increase your prices. You don't have to do it overnight. You try to foresee that. And if you can't, absolutely, there are occasions. And I hope that relationship with the landlord and the tenant might be able to alleviate that. So I think just giving one a notice of a significant rent increase so that tenant can make life decisions that are important. Maybe they can pick up a few more hours at work. Maybe they can delay getting their car repaired. Maybe they need to find another place to live in a market that's about 95%, if not more, saturated. So it is very hard to find another place to live, especially if they want to stay in their community. So I think this is a fairly simple and straightforward and fair piece of legislation. And there may be a difference of opinion on that. But thank you. I appreciate the time, and I am happy to take any questions from my friends on this committee. All right. Seeing none. Staff, let's first bring up, oh, don't you update, computer. Let's do, I think these are all remote. Corrick, Adams, and Valenzuela. All right. Is Corrick?
Yes.
Go ahead. And we have, again, a 90-second timer. Sorry about that. We have a lot of people wishing to testify. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. My name is Shannon Corrick, and I live in Cheney, Washington. Throughout the pandemic, when so many people were falling behind on rent, mine was always paid in full and on time with my essential worker wages. I had a house with a yard where my husband had a garden. My grandson could play on his swing set and run in the grass. This was our home. On May 29th, 2021, my mom and pop landlord sent us notice that our rent would be going up $300 on July 1st. We needed in less than 30 days to find and secure housing or face a $300 increase we could not afford and be locked into a 12-month lease. If we had chosen the month-to-month option, the increase would be $500, about a 50% increase. When we spoke to our landlord, he said, "That's what the market will bear." My family could not bear it. Many families can't. If we had been given 6 months' notice, I feel we could have found housing that would be more suitable for my family. The short notice contributed to the pressure to secure a home, any home, with thousands of dollars that I did not have available. This left me with little options. In fact, we found only one option, and only because a coworker was vacating her small apartment by the train tracks. We were forced into a situation where we had to borrow money from a family member to cover the cost of moving. My story isn't unique, except for the fact that I got very lucky. Other tenants in the state have to keep these kind of steep increases, often find themselves displaced by economic eviction. This is a problem across the state. And yet, I'm told that's what the market will bear. People are not the market, and people can't bear sharp increases with little notice. A requirement of 6 months' notice would help ease the burden on finding a new home, because just because you don't own the property doesn't mean it's not your home. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Adams is next on the list. Sari
Hi.
Adams. Hello there, welcome. Oop, we've lost you.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, yes, go ahead, thank you.
Good morning. I'm here in support of House Bill 1124, and thank you very much for all of you for doing this for us as a community and a world. I live in Washougal, Washington. I've been here over 20 years. I have resided in my apartment for 10 years now. I have paid all of my bills on time, in full. My landlord has never had to come after me for anything. Everybody in my community is on a fixed income. We're either retired military, disabled, or elderly. Our landlord came to us in August and gave us a rent increase of almost $400 on every apartment here. My income is $620 a month. My husband's income is $600 a month. That's not even enough to cover our rent. So as we speak, we are struggling to figure out what we're going to do to keep a roof over our heads. He is retired military, 21 years. He is retired government employee for 20 years and will now have to go seek other employment to be able to make our rent. So far, what we've done to survive is we've used his savings thrift plan to cover the rent. But when that runs out, it's going to be a very hard struggle for us. $400 at one time was a lot of rent to raise for people on a limited income. My rent went from $976 to $1365 in a matter of 60 days. And without enough notice, like I said, we're struggling to figure out where we're going to go. There are no low-income apartments available, and there is no other place out here that we can afford to rent and live in. Being on fixed income makes it twice as hard. And I do believe that our community deserves better. Our state deserves better. Communities like mine are most often vulnerable, and our cries fall on deaf ears. Nobody hears. So I am all for passing the bill 1124, which would give us more notice to try and come up with a way to sustain our households through this crisis of high rent prices. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. And next is Stacy Valenzuela.
Good morning, Stacy Valenzuela, District 1, Kenmore. Thousands of residents will be displaced if the short notice rent increases continue, increasing homelessness, living in encampments, cars, couch surfing. The choices homeowners at mobile home communities have are forced to be filed for housing assistance, attempt to quickly sell the home they own, or wait to be forced out with eviction. My city, several tenants were priced out even during COVID. Some abandoned their homes, some confiscated. They only had 30 to 90 days for the rent increase to be effective. At the end of December, the 55-plus park that I reside in was sold. Then came the 90-day notice of 17 to 30% rent increase on several senior neighbors with incomes of $900 to $1,200 monthly. Because my city adopted the rental tenant protections that several housing organizations supported, with being in noncompliance, they had to retract the initial increase. My increase will be effective in 180 days now, giving me some time to at least look at what my options are. Please vote pro for House Bill 1124 to adopt the 180-day plus protection of rent increase. Tenants with low and very low income need more time to apply for help or review options rather than face abandoning their homes or eviction. Thank you for consideration.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Any questions? No? All right, we will shift to in-person. Let's bring up Brad Tower, Ryan Erickson, and Audrey Riddle. Audrey, not here. Okay. Well, the two of you will get to. Welcome and
good morning.
Go ahead.
My name is Ryan Erickson. I run a property management company in Washington State called Commonwealth Real Estate. I'm here personally to be against House Bill 1124. But for the record, I want to be known that professionally, this bill is a giant benefit to my company because I'm a third-party management. I don't own the properties. I'm here to help owners navigate the complexity of this world. After this company being fairly steady for 35 to 40 years, during COVID, all the additional complexity and regulations introduced, our company grew to about double the size. And I expect with laws like this being passed, our company would have rapid growth going forward. So for the record, I'm arguing against my company's benefits here. The 5% restriction that's considered excessive here is a little bit disingenuous. Operating costs for our communities have gone up 10 or 12% in the last year. Taxes have often gone up double digits. We have 1 month warning from the Washington state government when those taxes will go up, and the government agrees that 1 month notice is enough, and agrees that raising those fees far above 5% is reasonable. Importantly, on the late fee portion, when you buy a Nintendo or a TV or a Lexus at the store, there's late fees on it and interest charged. And I really worry that if we make rent the lowest priority payment, it's going to increase people defaulting on rent and increase homelessness. And overall, I just want to make sure we don't increase the cost for the citizens or increase homelessness. And that's why I'm arguing against my company's benefits right now. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Brad Tower here, also today on behalf of Commonwealth Real Estate. I wanted to speak first about my personal experience. So in 2019, my parents needed to move into an assisted living facility. So I bought the family home with the intention of moving my family into it. But what you can imagine, when I listed my other home on the market in April of 2020, nobody came to look at it for 5 months. So I was obliged to put that onto the rental market. Now, my only goal with that property was to defray the costs: debt service, insurance, taxes, maintenance. But given the complexity of the rental market, I needed a professional manager to make sure that I didn't lose out on a significant financial piece of my portfolio. So I hired a very qualified local one, but that added 10 to 20% to the price that I had to charge in the marketplace to defray my costs. But I have to say, if I had rented that property without having a professional manager, I feel like I would have been driving without car insurance. It would have been great until something went wrong, and then as the property owner, I would have been in dire straits. Now, if I had only, during those 2 years, that Thurston County gave me double-digit increases in my property taxes each year, and if I had only increased my rent to compensate for those increases, I would have been deemed unreasonable under the statutes and the definition of base rent in here. Base rent is defined as the lowest rent in the 12 months preceding the notice. The notice must come out 6 months preceding the lease renewal. So you're really looking back. If I start on January 1st, on July 1st, I have to get notice about my increase in January, and you have to look back to the previous July. So it's over a 2-year period that 5% measurement would apply to what would be considered to be reasonable or unreasonable. Finally, I would say that Commonwealth Real Estate has a number of different types of properties, but we specialize in manufactured housing communities. Those are significantly different from other tenancies because the tenants own the dwelling. There's no vacation where they remove themselves in the dwelling from the property. They would sell the dwelling, and we are obliged to then renew the lease for the next person. So last year, this body chose not to include manufactured housing communities in the measure. I would say that was a prudent decision, and would recommend removing Section 6 and possibly the use of the term unreasonable in Section 1 if you move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Representative Hutchins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. I have 2 concerns that are on my mind right now. The first is with respect to the late fee. Can you speak to the flat rate? I see a grand total of $75 for any late rent, it occurs to me that there are some low-income markets and there are some high-income markets. There may be rental units that are $5,000, $7,000, $10,000 per month. A $75 late fee across the board seems to be disproportionate. Can you speak to that? Do you have any thoughts on that issue?
It is disproportionate, and if your late fee on your TV and home sound system you bought was $100 plus 20% interest on it, then you're going to be much more encouraged to pay your late fee on your non-essential item and less incentivized to pay your late fee on your residence, which, in my opinion, a home is much more important than those kind of items. So I disagree with having a set late fee or disincentivizing people to pay rent. I think there's other ways to go about it. And it should be noted already in King County, it's capped out at 1.5%. And so many of our mobile home or manufactured housing communities might have rent of $600, let's say, and 1.5% is such a small late fee that many people just choose to pay late forever, which creates a big problem.
Yes, follow up, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The second issue that's on my mind is the potential for this to become a backdoor to landlords getting their tenants out of the property before the end of the lease period. The provision says if when you give the notice of a rental increase of 5% or more, the tenant then has the opportunity to terminate the lease without penalty. I can certainly see a situation in which a landlord could use this provision to turn the screws on a tenant who doesn't want to deal with that kind of increase, who will then immediately go looking for other housing options, and then have that be a tool to push the tenant toward exercising their option to terminate the lease early, and have that kind of effect on tenants. I'm curious, especially from the property management standpoint, if you see that possibility, if that is something that we should be considering.
Can I clarify what you're asking? You're saying if, like, for example, over a 2-year period we raise rents 6%, it would encourage more tenants to leave?
Because the provision in the bill says they have the option once they receive that notice to terminate, to allow them to go and seek other housing. I could see this being a tool for landlords to actually put pressure on tenants to get out of the leases early, rather than the landlord obviously can't terminate a lease early outside of some very specific situations. So this sort of creates an opening for pressure to be put on tenants. As far as, and maybe I'm misreading the text of the bill, and maybe the prime sponsor could answer this question as well.
Thank you for the question. I don't see this encouraging tenants to vacate, because you could raise your rents 75%, and it would still not go into effect until the term is expired. And so currently, they could leave at that time regardless. What I see is a more likely scenario is you raise your rents 6% over a 2-year period, so 3% a year, and that would trigger this ability to leave early, and they would leave in the middle of September or October, and it's extremely rare that people rent between October and January. And so if you're anticipating 15% or 20% vacancy factor in your community, then you're also going to anticipate you have to raise the rents to compensate for your bills. And so I see this would negatively impact tenants with receiving higher rates going forward.
Thank you. Vice Chair Levitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. I want to go back to your comment that you see a $75 flat fee if we were to implement this bill with that provision in there as increasing homelessness. I'm not sure I understand your premise of the argument that would cause hardship when folks who maybe are paying a little bit late for a hardship, an additional $75 could create hardship on them. So I'm just unclear how you see that as increasing homelessness. Could you please help me understand that?
I really appreciate the question, and I'm sorry if my explanation wasn't good the first time. There is no late fee when residents pay their rent on time or within 5 days late. There's no late fees, so there is no hardship when people pay the bills. Where the hardship occurs is people routinely take on credit card debt that has a very high interest rate on it. They buy jewelry, they buy TVs, items that I wouldn't deem as necessary as housing. And because those fees are so much higher, if you have a $150 late fee on your credit card, you're more likely to pay that credit card bill and not your rent, because logically you want to pay whatever has the highest rate, right? And personally, I think the housing is more important, and we shouldn't discourage people from being current on their rent, because that creates all sorts of problems administratively for the landlord, a bunch of extra costs, and unfortunately it puts a big burden on tenants when they pay that late. It affects their credit going forward, and it could possibly lead to eviction. And so I don't think we should disincentivize people paying their rent.
Thank you. And Representative Connors.
In your expertise in the landlord, where you're representing landlords, not just manufactured landlords, I'm a little bit concerned because I know that we're in an affordable housing crisis right now. And so my concern is the effect that this might have on the landlords to then put their units onto the active real estate market and then sell them. And then we're going to then again decrease rental supply. Are you seeing that as an issue?
Absolutely. So our company has specialized in affordable housing for 40 years specifically. And we have mostly mom and pop clients that own one property that have decided no longer to invest in Seattle, and they've already vacated in the last few years. And then we have very few larger companies that own a few properties, and they're actually starting to pull back from any investment in Washington State, period, and instead invest their money in the flyover states where there's less restrictions and they feel like they can have a better rate of return and have less risk purchasing a property that could potentially be subject to so much legislation that they couldn't make a profit there. And so I just can't imagine that decreasing the supply of any product like housing would ever decrease the price. And so I think that anything that can be done to increase that supply would lower the price of housing.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? All right, seeing none, we have some here, some online, and some I'm not sure where they might be. So we'll bring up Michelle Thomas, who I know is here. Annie Sadler, okay, is not here. I know Devin Glazier is online, if you could queue him up as well. And Ishbel Dickens, I think, is also online, if you could queue her up. Yep, thumbs up I get. Excellent. So, Michelle, welcome again.
Hi, good morning again. My name is Michelle Thomas with the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance, pro on House Bill 1124. Thank you, Representative Peterson, for your leadership. The bill simply asks landlords to provide tenants with more time to plan for potentially destabilizing rent increases. Rents are already way too high, and yes, 5% rent increases are a lot for some tenants. The average rent in Washington State is $1,866, according to the University of Washington. Half of tenants who are low income are cost burdened in our state, meaning that they're already paying more than 30% of their income on rent. And 80% of very low income tenants are cost burdened. Every increase on top of Washington State's sky high rents is a hardship that threatens homelessness. Further, this bill limits late fees. This is critical because late fees do not incentivize tenants to pay their rent on time. Tenants already know that their rent eats first. What late fees do is kick a person when they're already down. They compound hardship, and they make it harder to get your life back into balance. Lastly, tenants should be able to move if they get a destabilizing rent increase and to not sit locked into a lease with the clock ticking down till the rent increase goes into effect. An affordable home is extremely hard to find, and households need to be able to seize what they can find when they can find it, instead of forgoing the opportunity while locked into an unsustainable lease. The bill is about basic fairness, and while it will not cap rent increases, it's critical and necessary to increase stability for renters statewide. Please do pass it. Thank you.
Thank you. And next, online, Evan Glazier.
Okay. Hear me again?
Yes.
Thank you. Devin Glazer again. Thank you for having me a second time. I'm still an attorney with Tenant Law Center. As I said, I speak with a lot of tenants who are facing housing insecurity and legal disputes with their landlords. Here to speak in support of House Bill 124 and its requirement of 6 months and a limit to late fees. I'm actually really happy renters were here to speak first because I talk to them every day and their stories are much more powerful than I can relay. But people are desperate because we are having a housing crisis. It is nearly impossible to find affordable housing. And right now, throughout most of Washington State, a tenant can find on 2 months' notice that they're not going to be able to afford their rent. I have one client who just received a 70% rent increase. That's an eviction by any other name. Time, 6 months, it's better than 2 months. And so we should by all means pass this bill, but this is only just like stopping the bleeding of a really, really bad crisis. And I hope that we do this and more. It takes tenants much longer than 2 months, often much longer than 6 months to find a new place they can afford if they can find one, and ensuring that they have both the flexibility to leave when they're able to find the new place and the time they need to find it is really crucial. We need to do a lot to stem our housing crisis to make sure that your constituents, your tenants, your residents can stay in their communities. But this is by all means a really good start and it should go forward. I'd also just like to speak, as people said, about regulations pushing people to leave their rental economy. Seattle is heavily regulated. More than half of Seattle residents are renters. There's the regulations don't chase away tenancies. It's a very thriving market. It's a very profitable market, and we need some basic protections for tenants who right now are just the profit engines of people who own buildings. All right, I don't have a clock up, so I'm going to assume I'm close to out of time. But thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That's because the chair forgot to start the clock. Thank you very much. And Ishbel Dickens.
Good morning, Rep. Peterson and members of the committee. My name is Ishbel Dickens. I've been working with and for manufactured homeowners for over 35 years as a community organizer, a legal aid attorney, and the executive director of the National Manufactured Homeowners Association. Representative Peterson, I think you must have read my prepared testimony because I too see this bill as a straightforward minor amendment to existing statutes. We're not saying that landlords cannot raise their rent by 5% or more. We're just saying, please give your tenants more notice so that they can prepare and make good decisions when they appreciate that their rent is going to go that high. For instance, manufactured homeowners like Ms. Valenzuela, who spoke earlier, a 28% increase. That's a lot of increase. A community in Forks, where the manufactured homeowners rent went from $350 a month to $1,000 a month. Giving them 6 months notice is the least landlords can do when that's a tremendous impact and a major trauma in their lives. House Bill 1124 is a straightforward bill. And assuming that landlords, as business owners, are diligent in making decisions and forecasting their future costs and expenses, I don't think it's too much to ask that they also give their tenants a heads up when substantial rent increases are coming their way. In the interest of fairness, please give your full support to House Bill 1124. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you for your testimony, and I believe we have some questions. Representative Parkas, did you have a question? He will reserve it. Anyone? All right, well, thank you all for your testimony. And now, staff, I think we have some folks online, Jeff Pack, Corey Brewer, and maybe Ken Ritter. But I think the first two are ready.
I get to be first here, I guess. Okay, my name is Jeff Pack. I am just a landlord here within Washington State. the continued onslaught of landlord tenant issues has really started to become a point where it's so incredibly onerous in this state to even be a landlord. It's hardly even worth it, as some other people have mentioned. The biggest problem that I see with this law is it's just not even remotely steep in any sort of economic reality. I mean, base inflation alone is generally considered at roughly around 3.5%. And so you're talking about a limited 5%. I see people who have said, well, landlords as professionals should be able to, forecast. Nobody in the world could forecast the amount of inflation that we've had. I mean, labor costs for me have doubled. Energy costs, things that the state has done to, cause the and federal government done to increase the cost of energy. These are all things that 5% doesn't even remotely even cover it. So I'll just kind of leave it with that. I mean, it's just, this thing is just not even remotely steeped in any kind of current economic reality, and nobody in the world could forecast the impacts and expenses that have come out of all this over the past 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. And next is Corey Brewer.
Good morning. Thank you. Corey Brewer. I've been a leasing and property management professional for over 10 years, working primarily with mom and pop housing providers. For starters, I'm a little jealous of the realtors that we heard from this morning. It would be nice to be here speaking in favor of something. Just quickly back to House Bill 1074 regarding deposits. I like what I'm seeing there. It's been improved over the last couple of years. Certainly still needs some work. As the chair mentioned, the devil is in the details. But I'm encouraged with some progress as we made on that. Back to 1124. I want to speak particularly to the 45-day walkaway provision. This part in particular is the biggest threat to housing affordability. A lease is a contract for a specified period of time, and neither party can just simply walk away from it. And the key issue that supporters of this type of a bill, I think, fail to realize is that it discourages people from providing housing. Now, we understand that housing affordability is a major issue, but this is not the way to solve it. Ultimately, this results in lost housing supply, which always leads to price increases. It's a short-sighted approach, in my opinion. It fails to consider long-term effects. I think you guys really need to refocus your energy on the types of things that will incentivize people to provide housing rather than deplete the supply. We've seen what's happened in Seattle. Thousands of single-family rental homes are no longer in the marketplace. And to the idea about forecasting carrying costs and things of that nature, to the last speaker's point, we saw maintenance costs, for one example, spike dramatically overnight, whether it's plumbers or roof repair or you name it. But really, I'm concerned about this 45-day walkaway. That seems like a gross violation of a private contract.
Great. Thank you for your testimony. And we do have one question from Representative Entman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am trying to understand your argument, or your preface is that this housing will no longer be in the market. It will no longer be in the rental market. That does not mean that the landlord won't put the home up for sale. Sure. And then it becomes a part of the it still remains a part of the housing market. So please explain or clarify your argument.
Sure. Earlier this year, I think it was in the spring, I ran some numbers on what is the average. I think I was looking at Seattle. You look at the average price to purchase a 3-bedroom home in Seattle versus the average cost to rent a 3-bedroom home in Seattle. And the cost to purchase was dramatically higher. I mean, it's not an apples to apples comparison with what real estate values have done in terms of appreciation recently, especially. That is out of reach for a lot of people. And so their only practical option is to lease a home. And further, there are a lot of people who want to lease a home rather than buy it because they favor the flexibility. They know they're only going to be in Seattle, for example, for a year or two, and it's much more convenient to rent a home. And I'm talking specifically about houses. I'm not talking about these huge apartment communities. I'm talking about a house 3 or 4 bedroom house or a family with children. That's what they need. They don't need a studio apartment, which is where most of your new construction you see is happening when it comes to rental housing or studios, 1 bedroom apartments. We're losing houses. And if we're talking about affordability, then it speaks directly to the availability of rental housing.
Great. And I think we have a follow-up from Representative Entman, and everybody can see the clock. We're about out of time, but so again, pre-apologies for those who signed up to testify. Written testimony is appreciated.
So as a landlord, usually rents are determined by a mortgage or other expenses that a person has. Most renters that I know could afford a mortgage if they could afford a down payment because they're already paying the landlord's mortgage. So they have the money. They are just not building generational wealth. They are allowing you or the landlord to build generational wealth. I'm not understanding your argument about the loss of rental property is somehow the loss of housing in our communities. Housing is unaffordable because, in my opinion, renters are paying much more than they've ever paid before for rental housing. But they could afford your mortgage because they're paying it, because usually you are charging a renter twice as much as what your mortgage is. Is that incorrect?
I can't speak to every individual case, but you make a good point about a down payment. That's an important piece of the puzzle. And if you're just looking at the monthly payment, you might be correct. But if you throw in that down payment, that is where it becomes out of reach, and the rental housing is an essential option that needs to be available for people.
Right.
And
I'm just gonna cut you off because we have about 2 minutes left, and I appreciate that. But yeah, it's tough to get into these back and forth. But I really appreciate the time that you're taking and the thoughtfulness to the answers. So some of this hopefully can take place offline. And I will see, I think, yes. And Vice Chair Alvarado has a quick question.
Thank you for your testimony. Even acknowledging that operating costs have been going up for property owners, I'm having a hard time understanding, and maybe you can help me understand, why from a business perspective you can't plan several months in advance providing notice to tenants for the costs that are going up. It seems that providing that notice provides more incentive for tenants to be able to pay their rent. So again, this is not about costs not going up on the operating side, but I'm wondering from an economic and a business perspective why you can't plan for those costs going up by giving notice to tenants.
I'm not really here necessarily speaking in opposition of a longer notice period. I was talking specifically about this 45-day walkaway and blowing up a mutually agreed contract.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And again, thank you all of those wishing to testify that couldn't. I appreciate your patience. Again, written testimony. I promise I will improve my time management skills. And with that, we are adjourned.